In the winter of 1852, in the snow-covered streets of Kyoto, a 12-year-old girl named Hana finds herself standing before the ornate gates of the Moonlight Pavilion, the most exclusive geisha house in the ancient capital. Her small hands clutch a worn cloth bundle containing everything she owns in the world, while tears freeze on her cheeks like tiny diamonds in the bitter cold. Tell me in the comments where you're listening to this story from, and what moves you most about a good period romance. Prepare yourself to experience a period romance full of dignity, second chances, and emotions that will never be forgotten. What secrets lie hidden behind the painted smiles of the floating world? Can love bloom between a child sold into servitude and a warrior bound by honor? And if you love stories like this, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to Whispers of Silk for more tales that will touch your heart. Act I, The Sail. The ancient capital of Kyoto lay blanketed in snow, its temples and traditional buildings transformed into a winter wonderland that belied the harsh realities of life for those without power or protection. The year 1852 had brought particular hardship to the common people, with failed harvests and rising taxes pushing many families to the brink of desperation. In the narrow alleys of the merchant quarter, where the smell of cooking rice mixed with the acrid smoke of charcoal braziers, stories of children being sold to pay debts had become as common as the morning frost. The Moonlight Pavilion stood like a jewel among the more modest establishments of Kyoto's pleasure district, its three-story structure rising elegantly against the gray winter sky. Paper lanterns hung from its eaves like frozen tears, their warm light promising refuge from the cold, but at a price that few could afford to pay. The building's dark wooden facade was adorned with intricate carvings of cranes and cherry blossoms, symbols of longevity and beauty that seemed to mock the transient nature of the lives lived within its walls. Inside the pavilion's main reception hall, the air was thick with the scent of expensive incense and the subtle perfume worn by the house's most prized entertainers. Silk screens painted with scenes of classical poetry divided the space into intimate alcoves, while the floors were covered with tatami mats, so fine they seemed to whisper secrets beneath the feet of those who walked upon them. This was a place where fantasy was crafted with the precision of a master artisan, where every detail was designed to transport visitors from the harsh realities of the outside world into a realm of beauty and desire. 12-year-old Hana knelt on a thin cushion in a small anteroom, her entire body trembling from a combination of cold and terror that had nothing to do with the winter weather outside. She had been brought to the Moonlight Pavilion by her uncle, a man whose gambling debts had grown so large that even selling his own niece seemed like a reasonable solution to his problems. Her parents had died in the cholera outbreak that had swept through Kyoto the previous summer, leaving her in the care of relatives who saw her as nothing more than a burden to be disposed of at the first opportunity. The child's kimono was simple, but clean, a pale pink silk decorated with small white plum blossoms that her mother had sewn by hand during the long winter evenings before her death. The garment was too thin for the weather, offering little protection against the cold that seemed to seep through the walls of even the most luxurious buildings. Her face, though bearing the promise of future beauty, was streaked with tears that she had tried desperately to hide, knowing instinctively that showing weakness would only make her situation worse. The mama-san of the Moonlight Pavilion, a woman named Okiku, whose painted face masked decades of experience in the buying and selling of human dreams, circled around Hana like a merchant appraising a piece of valuable merchandise. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, noted every detail: the child's delicate bone structure, the natural grace of her movements despite her fear, the way her hands trembled as she tried to maintain the proper posture that had been hastily taught to her during the journey to the pavilion. "She's very young," Okiku murmured to Hana's uncle, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who had conducted countless such transactions. "Training will take years, and there's no guarantee she'll develop the skills necessary to attract the kind of clientele we serve here. The investment is considerable, and the return uncertain." Hana's uncle, a thin man whose clothes reeked of sake and desperation, shifted nervously from foot to foot. "She's intelligent," he said, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to sound confident while selling his own flesh and blood. "Her mother taught her to read and write before she died. She learns quickly, and she's obedient. She'll cause no trouble." "Reading and writing are useful skills," Okiku acknowledged, though her tone suggested she was far from convinced. "But the arts we teach here require more than mere literacy. They require grace, musical ability, the capacity to entertain sophisticated men with conversation and performance. Not every child possesses such talents. As the two adults negotiated over her future, as if she were a piece of furniture to be bought and sold, Hana found herself thinking of her mother's final words to her. "Remember, my precious flower," she had whispered as the fever consumed her. "No matter what happens to you, no matter how dark the world becomes, you are more than what others see. You have a spirit that cannot be broken, a heart that cannot be bought. Hold on to that truth, and someday you will find your way back to the light." The memory of her mother's voice gave her a small measure of strength, enough to lift her head and meet Okiku's appraising gaze with something approaching dignity. The mama-san paused in her examination, surprised by the spark of defiance she saw in the child's eyes. It was a quality that could be either valuable or dangerous, depending on how it was channeled. "Very well," Okiku said, finally, naming a sum that made Hana's uncle's eyes widen with relief and greed. "But understand that this is an investment in potential, not a guarantee of success. If the child proves unsuitable for training, if she lacks the necessary talents or temperament, the loss will be ours alone." The transaction was completed with the same casual efficiency that might accompany the purchase of rice or silk. Money changed hands, papers were signed, and within the space of an hour, Hana's entire future had been decided by people who saw her as nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold. Her uncle left without a backward glance, his pockets heavy with gold, and his conscience apparently untroubled by what he had done. As the sound of his footsteps faded into the winter afternoon, Hana found herself alone with Okiku in the reception hall that would now be her prison. The mama-san studied her new acquisition with the calculating gaze of someone who had spent decades turning frightened children into profitable entertainers. "Your name is Hana," Okiku said, settling onto a silk cushion across from the trembling child. "A pretty name, though perhaps too common for our purposes. We shall have to consider something more evocative, something that speaks to the dreams and desires of our clientele." "I want to keep my mother's name for me," Hana said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Okiku raised an eyebrow, surprised by the child's boldness. "You want? Child, you are no longer in a position to want anything. You belong to the Moonlight Pavilion now, and you will be whatever we require you to be. Your old life, your old name, your old dreams, all of that is finished. The sooner you accept this reality, the easier your transition will be." But even as she spoke the harsh words, Okiku found herself oddly impressed by the child's spirit. Most girls arrived at the pavilion broken by fear and despair, ready to accept whatever fate was imposed upon them. This one, despite her obvious terror, still had fight left in her. That could be useful, if properly directed. "However," Okiku continued, her tone softening slightly, "perhaps we can find a compromise. Hana means flower, does it not? We could call you Yuki Hana, Snowflower. It suits both your name and the season of your arrival." Hana nodded gratefully, understanding that this small concession was likely the only kindness she would receive in this place. The name Yuki Hana would allow her to carry a piece of her mother's love with her, even as everything else from her old life was stripped away. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and overwhelming new experiences. Hana, now Yuki Hana, was assigned to a small room in the servants' quarters, a space barely large enough for a sleeping mat and a small chest for her few possessions. The room was cold and drafty, with paper walls so thin that she could hear every sound from the adjacent chambers. The soft shuffle of feet on tatami mats, the distant sound of shamisen music, and sometimes, late at night, sounds that she didn't understand but that filled her with a nameless dread. Her training began immediately and was more rigorous than anything she had ever experienced. She was awakened before dawn each day to begin lessons in deportment, learning to walk with the gliding grace expected of a geisha, to sit and kneel in positions that would become second nature, to control every gesture and expression until they conveyed exactly the right message to observers. The shamisen lessons were particularly challenging. The three-stringed instrument required not only musical ability, but also the development of calluses on her fingertips that would allow her to play for hours without pain. Her teacher, An elderly woman named Chio-san, whose own fingers were gnarled from decades of practice, showed no mercy to her young student. Music is the language of the heart, Chio-san would say, as she corrected Yukihana's finger positions for the 100th time. But it is also a discipline that requires absolute precision. A single wrong note can destroy the mood of an entire evening, can turn pleasure into disappointment. You must practice until the music flows from your soul without conscious thought. The dance lessons were equally demanding. Yukihana learned the classical forms that had been passed down through generations of performers. Each movement imbued with meaning and symbolism that spoke to educated audiences. She studied the subtle art of fan dancing, where a simple accessory became an extension of the performer's emotions, capable of conveying everything from shy modesty to passionate desire with the flick of a wrist. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of her training was learning to suppress her own personality, in favor of whatever persona was required for each situation. She was taught to read the moods and desires of potential clients, to become whatever they wanted her to be, innocent or sophisticated, playful or mysterious, depending on what would bring the greatest pleasure, and consequently, the greatest profit to the house. Months passed in this relentless routine of training and discipline. Yukihana's hands grew calloused from shamisen practice, her muscles ached from hours of dance rehearsal, and her mind reeled from the constant pressure to perfect skills that seemed impossibly complex. She lost weight, her child's roundness giving way to the more angular features that would eventually develop into the classical beauty that Okiku had recognized in her. But through it all, she held on to her mother's words, repeating them to herself like a prayer during the darkest moments when the weight of her situation threatened to crush her spirit entirely. She was more than what others saw. She had a spirit that could not be broken, a heart that could not be bought. Someday, somehow, she would find her way back to the light. It was during the spring of her first year at the Moonlight Pavilion that Yukihana first encountered the man who would change her life forever. She was practicing calligraphy in the small garden behind the servants' quarters, working on a poem about cherry blossoms that her literature teacher had assigned, when she became aware of someone watching her. Looking up from her writing, she saw a man standing in the shadows of the garden's single pine tree. He was tall and lean, dressed in the dark hakama and haori of a samurai, with 2 swords at his side that marked him as a member of the warrior class. His face was partially hidden by the shadows, but she could see enough to note the strong jawline and the way he held himself with the perfect posture of someone trained in the martial arts. What struck her most, however, was his absolute stillness. He stood like a statue, watching her with an intensity that should have been frightening, but somehow wasn't. There was something in his posture, in the way he observed her without moving or speaking, that suggested protection rather than threat. "Who are you?" she asked softly, setting down her brush and looking up at him with the directness that Okiku was constantly trying to train out of her. The man didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and quiet, like the sound of wind through bamboo. "I am Kenji," he said simply. "I come here sometimes to think." "This is private property," Yukihana said, though without any real authority behind the words. "The Mama-san doesn't allow strangers in the garden." "I have permission," Kenji replied, and something in his tone suggested that this was not a matter for debate. "What are you writing?" Yukihana looked down at her calligraphy, suddenly self-conscious about her still developing skills. "A poem about cherry blossoms. My teacher says I need to work on expressing emotion through brushwork. May I see?" She hesitated for a moment, then turned the paper so he could read her work. The poem was simple, speaking of the brief beauty of spring flowers, and the sadness that came with their inevitable falling. Her brushwork was careful, but still showed the uncertainty of a student rather than the confident strokes of a master. Kenji studied the poem for a long moment, his dark eyes moving across the characters with the attention of someone who understood both the technical aspects of calligraphy and the emotional content of the words. When he looked up at her again, there was something different in his expression, a softness that hadn't been there before. "You write of sadness," he said, "but also of hope. The cherry blossoms fall, but they will bloom again next spring. That is wisdom beyond your years." Yuki Hana felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her as if her thoughts and feelings mattered. As if she were a person worthy of consideration rather than simply a commodity being prepared for market. "Do you write poetry?" she asked, emboldened by his kindness. "Sometimes," Kenji admitted. "Though I am better with a sword than with a brush." "Are you a retainer to one of the daimyo?" Something flickered across Kenji's face at her question. A shadow of pain that was quickly suppressed. "I serve no master now," he said quietly. "I am Ronin." The word hung in the air between them like a confession. Ronin, masterless samurai, were often viewed with suspicion and pity in a society that valued loyalty and service above all else. To be without a lord to serve was to be adrift in a world that had no place for such men, forced to make their own way through whatever means they could find. "I'm sorry," Yuki Hana said softly, understanding instinctively that his status as Ronin represented some kind of loss or failure that caused him pain. "Don't be," Kenji replied, though his voice carried a weight that suggested the wound was still fresh. "Sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover who you truly are." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the garden path. Okiku appeared around the corner of the building, her painted face set in lines of displeasure as she took in the scene before her. "Yuki Hana," she said sharply, "you know you are not supposed to speak with visitors without permission. Return to your lessons immediately." Yuki Hana bowed quickly and gathered her writing materials. But as she rose to leave, Kenji spoke again. "The poem shows promise," he said, his words clearly intended for her to hear. "Continue to write from your heart, and your skill will follow." As she hurried back into the building, Yuki Hana felt something she hadn't experienced since her arrival at the Moonlight Pavilion. A sense of connection with another human being, who saw her as more than just a future source of profit. The encounter had lasted only a few minutes, but it had reminded her that there were still people in the world capable of kindness, still reasons to hope that her future might hold something other than the fate that seemed to await her. That night, as she lay on her thin sleeping mat, listening to the sounds of the pavilion around her, Yuki Hana found herself thinking about the Ronin's words. Sometimes losing everything was the only way to discover who you truly are. She wondered what he had lost, what had driven him from his position and left him wandering without purpose or place. And she wondered if perhaps, in their brief conversation, they had recognized something in each other. Two souls adrift in a world that seemed determined to define them by their circumstances rather than their true selves. Act 2. The Silent Guardian. As the seasons turned, and Yuki Hana's training progressed, her encounters with the mysterious Ronin became a regular part of her routine. Kenji appeared in the garden at unpredictable intervals, always silent until she acknowledged his presence, always respectful of the boundaries that separated their worlds. Their conversations were brief and carefully circumspect, but they became the bright spots in days that were otherwise filled with the relentless pressure of preparation for a future she dreaded. Yuki Hana learned that Kenji had been granted permission to use the garden by Okiku herself, though the exact nature of their arrangement remained mysterious. The Mama-san treated him with a deference that suggested either fear or respect, possibly both. When questioned about his presence, she would only say that he was a man of honor who pays his debts, leaving Yuki Hana to wonder what service he might have performed for the Moonlight Pavilion that earned him such privileges. As her 13th birthday approached, Yuki Hana's training intensified. She was no longer the frightened child who had arrived at the pavilion's gates. Months of rigorous discipline had transformed her into a young woman of grace and accomplishment. Her shamisen playing had improved to the point where even the critical Chiyo-san occasionally nodded in approval. Her dancing had acquired the fluid elegance that marked a true artist, and her calligraphy had developed the confident strokes of someone who understood that writing was not merely communication but art. But with her growing skills came the growing awareness of what her future held. She was being prepared for her debut as a Maiko, the apprentice stage that would eventually lead to her becoming a full geisha. The thought filled her with a dread that she struggled to hide from her teachers and the other girls in training. She had seen the older geishas return from their appointments, their painted smiles unable to completely mask the weariness in their eyes, and she understood that the beauty and artistry she was learning were merely the attractive wrapping around a transaction that reduced her to a commodity. It was during one of her garden conversations with Kenji that she finally voiced her fears. They were sitting beneath the pine tree, she working on a piece of embroidery while he sat in his characteristic stillness, when the words burst out of her like water through a broken dam. "I don't want to be a geisha," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of months of suppressed terror. "I know I have no choice. I know this is my fate, but I don't want it. I want to be free to choose my own life, to marry someone I love, to have children who will never know what it's like to be sold like livestock." Kenji was quiet for so long that she began to fear she had offended him with her outburst. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes. "What do you want?" he asked, simply. The question was so unexpected that Yukihana could only stare at him. No one had ever asked her what she wanted. Her desires and preferences had been irrelevant since the day she was sold, dismissed as the foolish dreams of a child who didn't understand the realities of the world. "I want to be a teacher," she said finally, the words coming out in a rush as if she were afraid he would stop her before she could finish. "I want to teach children to read and write, to help them discover the beauty in poetry and literature. I want to make a difference in their lives, to give them the tools they need to create their own futures." "That is a worthy dream," Kenji said. And there was no condescension in his voice, no suggestion that her aspirations were unrealistic or inappropriate for someone in her position. "But it's impossible," Yukihana continued, her voice breaking with the pain of acknowledging the truth. "I belong to the Moonlight Pavilion now. My life is not my own to direct." "Nothing is impossible," Kenji said quietly. "Difficult, yes. Dangerous, perhaps, but not impossible." Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. There was a quality to his stillness that she had noticed before but never fully understood. Not the stillness of someone at peace, but the stillness of someone holding himself under rigid control. It was the stillness of a man carrying a burden so heavy that any movement might cause it to shift and crush him entirely. "What did you lose?" she asked softly, the question slipping out before she could consider whether it was appropriate. Kenji's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear him. "Everything," he said simply. "My lord, my position, my honor, my family. What happened?" "I failed in my duty," Kenji replied, the words carrying the weight of a confession that had been eating at his soul for years. "I was charged with protecting my lord's daughter, a girl not much older than you are now. She was to be married to cement an alliance between our clan and another, but she was in love with a young samurai from a rival family." He paused, staring out at the garden as if seeing not the carefully tended plants but some scene from his past that continued to torment him. "She begged me to help her escape," he continued. "She said she would rather die than be forced into a marriage with a man she despised. I should have refused, should have reminded her of her duty to her family and her clan. Instead, I helped her flee." Yukihana felt her heart clench with sympathy for both the young woman who had sought freedom and the samurai who had risked everything to help her. "What happened to her?" "She was caught before she could reach her lover," Kenji said, his voice flat with old pain. "Brought back in disgrace, the marriage alliance was destroyed, and my lord's position was severely weakened. In his anger and shame, he ordered me to commit seppuku to restore the family's honor." "But you're here," Yukihana said, confused. "I fled," Kenji admitted, the words seeming to tear at his throat. "Like a coward, I ran rather than face the consequences of my actions. My lord's daughter was forced into an even worse marriage as punishment for her attempted escape. My family was stripped of their lands and positions. Everything I touched was destroyed because I chose compassion over duty." The silence that followed his confession was heavy with shared pain. Yukihana understood now why he carried himself with such rigid control. why his stillness seemed to vibrate with suppressed emotion. He was a man who had lost everything because he had chosen to help someone who reminded him of her, a young woman trapped by circumstances beyond her control, desperate for freedom that seemed impossible to achieve. "You're not a coward," she said finally, her voice firm with conviction. "You chose to help someone who needed it, even knowing the cost. That's not cowardice, that's courage." Kenji looked at her with surprise, as if her words had struck him like a physical blow. "The cost was too high," he said. "Too many people suffered because of my choice. And how many people would have suffered if you had done nothing?" Yuki Hana countered. "That girl would have been forced into a marriage that would have made her miserable for the rest of her life. Sometimes the right choice is the one that costs us everything." They sat in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Kenji spoke again, his voice carrying a new quality that Yuki Hana couldn't quite identify. "If you truly want to be free," he said slowly, "if you're willing to accept the risks and the costs, there might be a way." Yuki Hana's heart began to race, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What do you mean?" "I have been watching this place for months," Kenji said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Learning its routines, its weaknesses. I know when the guards change shifts, which doors are left unattended, how the night watch moves through the building. If someone were determined to leave, and if they had help—" "You would help me escape?" Yuki Hana asked, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I failed to save one young woman," Kenji said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "Perhaps I can succeed with another." The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Yuki Hana felt her heart pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. The possibility of freedom, of choosing her own path, was so overwhelming that she could barely process it. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, practical considerations began to assert themselves. "Where would I go?" she asked. "I have no money, no family, no skills that would allow me to support myself outside of this world." "There are places," Kenji said carefully, "temples that take in refugees, communities where a woman with your education could find work as a teacher or scribe. It would not be easy, and there would be dangers, but it would be your choice to make." "And what about you?" Yuki Hana asked. "If you help me escape, what happens when they discover I'm gone? They'll know someone helped me, and you're the only outsider with access to the pavilion." Kenji's smile was sad but genuine. "I am already a dead man walking," he said. "I have been since the day I chose to run rather than face my shame. Perhaps helping you find your freedom will finally give my life some meaning." Yuki Hana felt tears prick her eyes at the quiet resignation in his voice. Here was a man who had lost everything, who carried the weight of his failures like a physical burden, yet he was willing to risk what little he had left to help her. The generosity of the offer was almost more than she could bear. "I need time to think," she said finally. It's everything I've dreamed of, but it's also terrifying. If we're caught—" "I understand," Kenji said, rising to his feet with the fluid grace of a trained warrior. "Take all the time you need, but remember, the longer you wait, the closer you come to your debut. Once that happens, once you begin entertaining clients, escape becomes much more difficult." As he walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the garden like a ghost, Yuki Hana remained sitting beneath the pine tree, her mind reeling with the possibilities and dangers that his offer represented. For the first time since her arrival at the Moonlight Pavilion, she had a choice to make, not about what kimono to wear or which poem to recite, but about the fundamental direction of her life. The decision would not be easy. Escape meant leaving behind the only security she had known since her parents' death, venturing into a world that held no guarantees of safety or success. But staying meant accepting a future that filled her with dread, surrendering her dreams and her autonomy to become what others wanted her to be. As she sat in the gathering dusk, listening to the sounds of the pavilion preparing for another evening of entertainment, Yukihana thought of her mother's words. "You have a spirit that cannot be broken, a heart that cannot be bought." Perhaps it was time to prove that those words were more than just the desperate hope of a dying woman. Perhaps it was time to choose freedom regardless of the cost. That night, as she lay on her sleeping mat, staring up at the ceiling, Yukihana made her decision. She would accept Kenji's offer, would trust her future to a Ronin who had already lost everything, and a plan that might well end in disaster for them both. But for the first time in over a year, she would be making a choice based on her own desires, rather than the expectations of others. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Tomorrow, she would begin planning her escape from the Moonlight Pavilion, and her journey toward a future that was entirely her own to create. Act 3. The Escape. The next few weeks passed in a haze of careful planning and barely controlled anxiety. Yukihana continued her training with the same dedication she had always shown, giving no outward sign that anything had changed, while secretly she and Kenji worked out the details of her escape. Their conversations in the garden became exercises in coded language, discussing poetry and philosophy while actually planning routes, timing, and contingencies. Kenji had spent months observing the Moonlight Pavilion's routines, and his knowledge proved invaluable. He knew that the night guards made their rounds every 2 hours, that the kitchen door was left unlocked until midnight for late deliveries, and that the servants' quarters were largely unmonitored after the evening meal. Most importantly, he had identified a window in the storage room that faced the back alley, a window that was never locked because it was considered too small and too high for anyone to use as an exit. "The new moon is in 3 days," Kenji told her during one of their garden meetings. "The darkness will provide cover, but it also means we'll have to navigate by memory and touch. Are you certain you can find your way from your room to the storage area without light?" Yukihana nodded, though her heart was racing at the thought of actually putting their plan into action. "I've been practicing the route every night. 15 steps from my door to the main corridor. Turn left, 23 steps to the storage room door. And if you encounter someone, I'm going to the kitchen for water because I'm feeling unwell," she recited. "It's a reasonable excuse for being out of my room at night." Kenji studied her face in the fading afternoon light, noting the tension around her eyes and the way her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked gently. "There's no shame in changing your mind. This plan carries enormous risks for both of us." Yukihana was quiet for a moment, considering his question seriously. The truth was that she was terrified of being caught, of the punishment that would surely follow, of the unknown future that awaited her beyond the pavilion's walls. But stronger than her fear was the desperate need to reclaim control over her own life. "I'm scared," she admitted, "but I'm more afraid of what will happen if I stay. My debut is scheduled for next month. Once that happens, once I begin entertaining clients, I'll never have another chance at freedom." "Then we proceed as planned," Kenji said, his voice carrying the quiet determination of a man who had found his purpose again. 3 nights from now, when the temple bells ring midnight, be ready." The intervening days crawled by with agonizing slowness. Yukihana threw herself into her training with renewed intensity, partly to avoid suspicion and partly to distract herself from the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her. She practiced her shamisen until her fingers bled, rehearsed her dances until her muscles screamed in protest, and worked on her calligraphy until the characters blurred before her exhausted eyes. But even as she went through the motions of her normal routine, her mind was constantly focused on the escape plan. She memorized every detail of the route, from her room to the storage area, counted steps and identified landmarks that would guide her in the darkness. She prepared a small bundle of essential items, a change of clothes, what little money she had managed to save, and a small scroll containing one of her mother's poems that she had copied from memory. On the night of the escape, Yukihana lay on her sleeping mat fully clothed, listening to the sounds of the pavilion settling into its nighttime routine. The last clients had departed hours ago. The servants had finished their cleaning duties, and even the night guards had begun their predictable pattern of rounds. When the temple bells finally rang midnight, their bronze voices carrying across the sleeping city, She rose silently and began to make her way toward freedom. The corridor outside her room was pitch black, but she had practiced this route so many times that her feet found their way automatically. 15 steps to the main corridor, her hand trailing along the wall to guide her. Turn left, 23 steps to the storage room door. Her heart was pounding so loudly that she was certain it would wake the entire pavilion, but she forced herself to move with the gliding grace that had been drilled into her during months of training. The storage room door opened silently on well-oiled hinges, and Yuki Hana slipped inside, closing it carefully behind her. The room was filled with the scent of rice and pickled vegetables, stacked supplies creating a maze of shadows in the darkness. She made her way carefully toward the back wall, where the window waited like a portal to another world. Kenji was already there, his dark silhouette barely visible against the slightly lighter rectangle of the window. He had managed to open it without making a sound, and cold night air flowed into the stuffy storage room like a promise of freedom. "Are you ready?" he whispered, his voice so quiet it was barely more than a breath. Yuki Hana nodded, then realized he couldn't see her in the darkness. "Yes," she whispered back. Kenji had brought a rope, which he secured to a heavy beam near the window. The drop to the alley below was only about 10 feet, but in the darkness it seemed like a chasm. He went first, lowering himself hand over hand with the silent efficiency of someone trained in such maneuvers, then waited below to catch her if she fell. Yuki Hana's hands shook as she grasped the rope, but she forced herself to move. The rough hemp burned her palms as she lowered herself toward the alley, her feet scrabbling against the wooden wall of the building. When she finally felt Kenji's hands steady her as she reached the ground, she nearly collapsed with relief. They were in a narrow alley behind the Moonlight Pavilion, surrounded by the sleeping bulk of other buildings. The night was cold and clear, with stars visible between the overhanging eaves of the surrounding structures. For the first time in over a year, Yuki Hana was outside the pavilion's walls without permission, without supervision, without anyone controlling her movements. "This way," Kenji whispered, taking her hand and leading her deeper into the maze of alleys that crisscrossed Kyoto's pleasure district. They moved like shadows, avoiding the main streets where the night watch might spot them, sticking to the narrow passages where honest citizens never ventured after dark. They had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when disaster struck. As they rounded a corner into a slightly wider street, they found themselves face to face with two of the pavilion's guards, who were apparently conducting an unscheduled patrol of the surrounding area. "You there?" one of the guards called out, his hand moving instinctively to the sword at his side. "Stop." Kenji reacted with the lightning reflexes of a trained warrior, pushing Yuki Hana behind him and drawing his own sword in a single fluid motion. The blade sang as it cleared the scabbard, its polished steel catching the starlight like captured moonbeams. "Run," he said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in combat situations. "Follow the plan we discussed. Don't look back. I won't leave you," Yuki Hana protested, even as the guards advanced with their own weapons drawn. "You must," Kenji replied, his eyes never leaving his opponents. "This is why I'm here. Go, now." The first guard lunged forward with a cry that shattered the night's silence, his sword aimed at Kenji's heart. But the Ronin was no longer where the blade expected to find him, having moved aside with the fluid grace of water flowing around a stone. His own sword flashed in a counterattack that sent the guard stumbling backward, clutching a wounded arm. Yuki Hana stood frozen for a moment, torn between her desire to help and her understanding that staying would only make Kenji's task more difficult. The sound of steel clashing against steel filled the narrow street, punctuated by the harsh breathing of men fighting for their lives. "Go," Kenji shouted again, parrying a thrust from the second guard while keeping the first at bay with a series of lightning-fast cuts that forced him to give ground. Finally, Yuki Hana turned and ran, her feet carrying her through the maze of alleys toward the rendezvous point they had agreed upon. Behind her, the sounds of combat continued, but she forced herself not to look back, knowing that Kenji's sacrifice would be meaningless if she was recaptured. She ran through the sleeping city like a ghost, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the cobblestones, her dark clothing rendering her nearly invisible in the shadows. The temple where they had planned to meet was on the far side of Kityo, a journey that would normally take an hour but which she covered in half that time, driven by desperation and the adrenaline of her escape. The Temple of the Peaceful Heart stood on a hill, overlooking the city. Its ancient buildings silhouetted against the star-filled sky like the bones of some sleeping giant. Yukihana collapsed at its gates, her lungs burning from the run, her heart pounding with exhaustion and terror. She had made it to the rendezvous point, but Kenji was nowhere to be seen. She waited in the shadows of the temple gates, as the night slowly gave way to dawn, watching the eastern horizon for any sign of the man who had risked everything to give her this chance at freedom. But as the first rays of sunlight began to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, she was forced to accept the truth that she had been trying to deny. Kenji was not coming. Act 4. The Truth Revealed. 3 days later, as Yukihana huddled in the small room that the temple's abbess had provided for her, she learned the truth about what had happened that night in the alley. A young monk brought her the news along with her morning meal, his face grave with the weight of what he had to tell her. "The Ronin who helped you escape," he said quietly, settling onto a cushion across from her. "His name was Kenji Matsuda, was it not?" Yukihana nodded, her heart clenching with dread at the monk's solemn tone. "He was found yesterday morning in the alley behind the Moonlight Pavilion," the monk continued. "He had been killed in combat with the pavilion's guards, but not before he had defeated both of his opponents. The authorities are calling it a case of a masterless samurai attempting to rob the establishment, but those of us who know the truth understand what really happened." Yukihana felt the world tilt around her as the full impact of his words sank in. Kenji was dead, the man who had given her freedom, who had seen something in her worth saving, had paid for her escape with his life. "There's more," the monk said gently. "Before he died, he managed to leave something for you." The abbess found it hidden near the temple gates. He handed her a small scroll, sealed with wax and bearing her name in Kenji's careful calligraphy. With trembling hands, she broke the seal and unrolled the paper, revealing a letter that would change everything she thought she knew about the man who had saved her. "My dear Yukihana," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then our plan has succeeded and you are free, though I am not there to share in your victory. Do not mourn for me. My death was always part of this plan, though I could not tell you so without risking your refusal to accept my help. There is something about myself that I have never told you, something that explains why I was so determined to help you escape the fate that awaited you at the Moonlight Pavilion. My real name is not Kenji Matsuda, as I told you, but Kenji Yamamoto. I am the son of Magistrate Takeshi Yamamoto, one of the most powerful men in Edo. The story I told you about failing to protect my lord's daughter was true, but incomplete. The young woman I helped to escape was not just any lord's daughter. She was my own sister, Sakura. She had been promised in marriage to a cruel man who would have made her life a misery, and when she begged for my help, I could not refuse her. Our father discovered my role in her escape, and in his rage disowned me completely. He declared me dead to the family, stripped me of my name and inheritance, and forbade me from ever returning to Edo. Sakura was forced into an even worse marriage as punishment for her defiance, and she died in childbirth less than a year later, far from home and family. I have spent the last 3 years wandering Japan as a Ronin, carrying the weight of my failures and searching for some way to atone for the pain I caused. When I saw you in the Moonlight Pavilion's garden, so young and frightened yet still fighting to maintain your dignity, I saw my sister as she had been at your age. I knew that I had been given a chance to succeed where I had failed before. I want you to know that helping you escape was not just an act of charity, but a gift you gave to me. For the first time since Sakura's death, I felt that my life had purpose, that my skills and experience could be used to protect rather than destroy. You gave me back my honor, even as I gave you your freedom. The abbess of the Temple of the Peaceful Heart is a woman of great wisdom and compassion. She has agreed to help you begin your new life, to provide you with the training and connections you will need to become the teacher you dream of being. Trust her guidance, and remember that you are stronger than you know. Live well, Yuki Hana. Live freely, and remember that sometimes the greatest gift we can give another person is the chance to choose their own destiny. With all my respect and affection, Kenji. Yukihana read the letter 3 times before its full meaning sank in. Kenji had not just been a Ronin seeking redemption. He had been the son of one of the most powerful families in Japan. A man who had given up everything not once but twice to protect young women, who reminded him of his lost sister. The revelation explained so much about him: his education, his refined manners, the way he carried himself with unconscious authority even in his disgrace. It also explained why he had been so determined to help her, why he had been willing to risk his life for a girl he barely knew. But perhaps most importantly, it explained the true nature of his sacrifice. He had not died as a failed Ronin, seeking to atone for past mistakes. He had died as a brother, honoring his sister's memory, as a protector fulfilling his true purpose, as a man who had finally found a way to transform his pain into something meaningful. The days that followed were a blur of grief and adjustment as Yukihana began to build her new life under the abbess's guidance. The Temple of the Peaceful Heart was not just a religious institution but also a school that served the surrounding community, teaching children from families too poor to afford private tutors. The abbess, a woman named Geisha, who had once been a court lady before taking religious vows, recognized Yukihana's potential immediately. "You have the education and the temperament to be an excellent teacher," Geisha told her, during one of their early conversations. "But more than that, you have the experience to understand what it means to be powerless, to have your choices taken away from you. That understanding will make you a better teacher than someone who has never known hardship." Under Jishin's guidance, Yukihana began to develop the skills she would need for her new profession. She learned not just how to teach reading and writing, but how to inspire children to love learning, how to see potential in students that others might dismiss, how to create an environment where every child felt valued and capable of growth. She also learned about the network of people who had made her escape possible. Kenji had not acted alone. He had been part of a loose organization of individuals who worked to help those trapped in situations they could not escape on their own. Some were former samurai like himself. Others were merchants or artisans or even reformed criminals. But all were united by the belief that everyone deserved the chance to choose their own path in life. "Your friend was not the first to sacrifice himself for this cause," Jishin explained. "Nor will he be the last. But his death was not meaningless. It was the price of your freedom. And through your freedom, the freedom of all the children you will teach and inspire in the years to come." As the months passed, Yukihana threw herself into her new role with the same dedication she had once brought to her geisha training. She discovered that she had a natural gift for teaching, an ability to connect with children and help them discover their own potential. Her students ranged from the children of poor farmers to the offspring of minor merchants, all united by their hunger for knowledge and their trust in the young woman who had become their teacher. She never forgot Kenji's sacrifice, or the debt she owed to his memory. In her small room at the temple, she kept his letter along with the poem her mother had written, 2 pieces of paper that represented the love and sacrifice that had shaped her life. And every year on the anniversary of her escape, she would visit the small shrine that had been erected in Kenji's memory, leaving flowers and prayers for the man who had given her the chance to choose her own destiny. Epilogue. 5 years later, Yukihana stood before a classroom filled with eager young faces, teaching them the same lesson that had once seemed so impossible to believe, that they were more than what others saw, that they had spirits that could not be broken and hearts that could not be bought. Her students came from all walks of life, but they all shared the same hunger for knowledge and the same dreams of creating better lives for themselves and their families. The school had grown under her guidance, expanding from a single classroom to a complex of buildings that served hundreds of children throughout the region. Yukihana had become known not just as an excellent teacher, but as an advocate for children's rights, working with local authorities to ensure that no child would be sold into servitude as she had been. She had also become a link in the same network that had helped her escape, working quietly to identify and assist other young people trapped in situations they could not escape on their own. It was dangerous work, but it was also deeply meaningful, a way of honoring Kenji's memory and ensuring that his sacrifice continued to bear fruit. On this particular morning, as she watched her students practice their calligraphy with the same intense concentration she had once brought to her own studies, Yukihana reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. She had been sold as a commodity and had found her calling. She had expected to lose her freedom and had instead discovered her purpose. She had thought her story was ending, and had instead found that it was just beginning. The frightened child who had been sold to the Moonlight Pavilion was gone, replaced by a woman who understood her own worth and had the power to help others discover theirs. And the Ronin who had died to give her that chance lived on in every child she taught, every life she touched, every person who found the courage to choose their own path because of the example she set. In the floating world of the Geisha district, where beauty was currency and innocence was a commodity to be bought and sold, one man had chosen to see a human being instead of property, and that choice had created ripples of change that extended far beyond what either of them could have imagined, touching lives and creating possibilities that would outlive them both. As the morning sun streamed through the classroom windows, illuminating the faces of children bent over their writing, Yukihana smiled and began the day's lesson. She had work to do, lives to touch, futures to shape, and somewhere she knew Kenji's spirit was watching and approving of the woman she had become, and the difference she was making in the world. The cherry blossoms outside the window were beginning to bloom, their pink petals a reminder that beauty was fleeting, but that the seeds of hope, once planted, could grow into something that would last forever. And in that classroom, surrounded by the eager voices of children learning to read and write and dream, Yukihana knew that she had finally found her way back to the light. This story reminds us that sometimes the most profound acts of love require the greatest sacrifices, and that the true measure of a person's worth is not in what they achieve for themselves, but in what they give to others. Kenji's journey from disgraced samurai to selfless protector shows us that redemption is always possible for those willing to put others' needs before their own, and that sometimes losing everything is indeed the only way to discover who we truly are. Yukihana's transformation from frightened child to inspiring teacher demonstrates that our circumstances do not define our destiny, and that with courage, determination, and the support of those who believe in us, we can overcome even the most difficult beginnings to create lives of meaning and purpose. Their story together is a testament to the power of seeing the humanity in others, of choosing compassion over convenience, and of believing that everyone deserves the chance to write their own story. In a world that often treats people as commodities, their bond reminds us that the greatest gift we can give another person is the freedom to choose their own path. If this story touched your heart, leave the word Sakura in the comments so I know you stayed until the end. And if you want more stories of courage triumphing over adversity and love conquering tradition, don't forget to check out the other tales I've shared. Thank you for joining me in this journey through Edo period Japan. Remember to share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion is choosing to help another person find their freedom, even when it costs us everything. If this tale stirred something deep within you, subscribe to Whispers of Silk for more stories that whisper truth in the quiet of the soul.